So, how does this? We don't touch our vulvas at the table. Now, this title came from the first time I caught one of my daughters playing with her vulva. And the thing is, vulva is a word that doesn't get used very often in conversation, and it's a word that I didn't actually become familiar with until I was an adult in my family. We talked about penises and vaginas, but we didn't talk about vulvas. And so it wasn't until I was actually pregnant that I learned the difference between the vaginal canal and the external genitalia, which is the vulva. And so it was sort of important to me to keep terminology correct once I had children, because growing up with the wrong information about your own body is harmful, and we'll get to that. So I walk into the living room, and my 2.5, 3-year-old is playing with her vulva. And I had a moment of just like, shock, and what am I going to do about it? I turned around and I walked out again. It's like, okay, I don't want to get upset, I don't want to yell, I don't want to do any shaming, I don't want to scar her for life, and next time we're just going to talk about boundaries and, so on and so forth. And so the next time that I caught her playing with her vulva in an inappropriate location was the next day, and I said, it's fine to play with your vulva, but there's privacy. And people like to have privacy when they're in the bathroom, and people like to have privacy when they're playing with their vulvas, or if they're boys with their penises, and so on and so forth. And therefore, if you want to play with your vulva, that's fine, but you have to go to your bedroom. And I made sure to say, if you're going to play with your vulva, a bedroom is best. You can touch your vulva. It's fine to wipe yourself in the bathroom. It's fine to wash yourself in the tub. But you shouldn't let other people play with your vulva. It's just private. It's for you. It's okay if mommy and daddy help you in the bath. It's okay if we help you wipe, but vulvas are private. And she was like, okay. And she went to her room to keep playing with her vulva. Of course, you have to tell kids things about 1 billion times. So before long, I had two-year-olds playing with their vulvas at the dinner table. And it just became like this go-to thing. And my husband, he just sort of followed my lead. I'd walk in from like bringing in the broccoli from the stove, and he'd say, hey, we don't play with our vulvas at the table. And that was that. And so this is sort of a how to manage to have conversations like that with your kid, and then moving forward, because obviously sex positivity doesn't end with knowing where it is okay to play with your vulva. Because I do have small children, and because mostly I write about parenting issues, this PowerPoint is largely illustrated with pictures from picture books that I have at home and read with my children, whether or not I like them. This is one that is probably familiar to many of you. It's one of the most popular potty training books out there. This is Prudence, and she's learning to use the potty, and she has many fine and useful parts. And the thing is, from the beginning, we talk to our kids about their bodies, and we try to be honest with them for the most part. This is your head. This is what you do with it. These are your fingers. Aren't they cool? These are your eyes. You use them for seeing. We have songs, head, shoulders, these and toes, these and toes. And then we have euphemisms. She has a pee-pee for making wee-wee. And kids notice this. They're not oblivious when suddenly their anatomical organs are being given cutesy baby names that don't really relate to anything else in their environment. They kind of get that. And what they don't get is that, well, wow, that organ has a weird name. What they get is, I'm not supposed to call this whatever it's really called, and so that must be bad. So starting from there, starting from the beginning, you name things what they are, you call them what they are, and you empower children by doing that. When a child knows, first of all, that that area over there that is poorly illustrated, because this is a children's book, is called a vulva, and they know that they're the only person who gets to play with it, until they're grown up and they can make these other decisions, then they also know that if someone, an adult or an older child, attempts to play with their vulva, that first of all, that's not okay, and second of all, they can name it. They can go to an adult in their life and they can say, hey, somebody touched my vulva, and isn't that something they're not supposed to do? And that's empowering to children, and it keeps them safe, protects them from predators in a way that we don't generally think of when we talk about sex and children, which is another thing I'll get to in a bit. Procreative Honesty. This is one of my favorite books about where babies come from. This is from a book called What Makes a Baby? And it's one of my favorite books because it's totally gender inclusive, it's totally poly inclusive, it's science inclusive. And this is important because more and more children are born via C-section, and more children are born via IVF or intrauterine insemination. There are so many more elements to the story than what we tell children. And what we tell children almost always is a lie. The go-to that we think we're being honest about when we talk to our kids is when a mommy and a daddy love each other very much. Then daddy puts his penis in mommy's vagina, and then there's a baby. And that's just not the way it works. We all, as adults, we all know that that's not true. And most importantly, we know that this isn't just something mommies and daddies do. And it's not just something mommies and daddies do in order to make a baby. If we're talking about making a baby, and children are fascinated with their own origins and will ask endlessly, where did I come from? If they have a younger sibling, how did that happen? If a friend has a younger sibling, if there's a relative who's pregnant, if they see a pregnant lady and they say, oh, look at that fat lady, and you say, no, there's a baby in that lady's tummy, then all of a sudden you're having a conversation about procreation, and you have to be honest about it. A stork didn't come in the middle of the night and deliver your baby sister. Mommy and daddy didn't pray really, really hard and get a baby put in their tummy, right? That's not what happens. What happens is that there's a sperm, and there's an egg, and there's a uterus. And you need to have all three of those in the same place at the same time in order for them to eventually become a baby. My twins were conceived with IVF, and were born via C-section. So when I tell them, this is how you make a baby, I can't say, well, mommy and daddy had sex, and then 9 months later, I pushed you out of my vagina, which is a nice, easy answer for people, but I can't do that. That's lying. What I have to say is, well, daddy contributed sperm, and mommy contributed the eggs, and I don't generally go into the detail. They are very young still about how incredibly uncomfortable that process is. But I do tell them that, a doctor had to cut a hole in mommy's tummy and pull out the babies. And so they know that. They know those origin stories. And what I like to tell my friends when we talk about IVF is that a team of highly trained physicians takes goo from one parent and goo from another parent and puts them into a dish together, and God makes a baby. So it's honesty you have to keep in mind always when you're talking to your children, every element of it. And puberty is a huge part of that. Because little kids, when they start asking, this is from a book called What's Happening to Me by Peter Mayle. It's an adorable guide to puberty. And what happens is children ask questions that are relevant to them when they're relevant to them. When a child is 4 and they have a friend who's got a baby sister, that's relevant to them. When they're 7 and you're trying to say, look, in a few years you might start going through changes, they're not going to give a crap. It's not relevant, and kids are kind of short-sighted in general. There's exceptions. Every child is unique. Every person is unique. But you have to take things as they come. And so, like Brock's mom, when he came and asked questions, you answer them, and you answer them completely. And part of puberty honesty is being honest about what's happening to the other side during puberty. It's not just talking about, well, my daughters. I'm not just going to tell them all about this. This is not from a children's book. I just love this illustration. And this is one of those things where if you're not talking about comprehensive sex education, these words are meaningless. Girls are taught in their isolated little units that once a month you're going to bleed from your vagina, and it's going to last a couple of days, and then it's over, and then the next month it'll happen again. And they don't tell you that there's going to be consistency changes because you're shedding an endometrial lining. They don't generally tell you that it comes with cramps or with mood swings because of its hormonal components. And certainly they don't tell you that there's going to be a wide variety of colors involved. And that is terrifying for preteen and teenage girls. The first time that they have a period that isn't exactly like what I can see a lot of girls out here nodding, like, yeah, like what the fuck was that? And it's true. And part of that comes from this sense that, like, oh, I know that you know that menstruation is this thing that happens, and so I'm not going to give you the really icky details. But you've got to do that, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but it happens as a process. You don't say, okay, my child, you're a woman now. Here's a diaphragm. Here is a 28-day chart for you to start tracking your menstrual cycle. Here is a list of places to go to get STD screenings. Here is a long discussion about consent. You start with things as they come, and it's important to have all those conversations, but not to sit down and have one giant talk all together. This is from another Peter Mayle book. This is called Where Did I Come From? I also adore this illustration. I think it's just so cute. Chubby, round little mommy and daddy having a special hug. But, once again, it's just sex. And so you can say things like, it feels good. And we like doing things that feel good. I like hugging daddy because it feels good to hug daddy, and daddy likes hugging mommy because it feels good to hug mommy, and I like hugging you, but we have different boundaries. And obviously, and privacy is important. And so the way that I'm friends with you isn't the way you're friends with your friends at school, and the way I'm friends with daddy is different. And as you grow up, you start to have different kinds of friendships and different kinds of feelings, and the way that sexual adults choose to experience that particular set of emotions. And when they're older, I'm sure I'll have a whole new set of vocabularies to use with them, is that we like to have sex. And I don't say we have to have sex to have babies. We like to have sex, because that is true. We really like to have sex. And so, you don't have to give them, and this is something parents freak out about a lot, is if I tell my kids that I like to have sex, am I going to have to tell them the kind of sex that I'm having? And the answer is no. You absolutely don't. You don't have to tell your kids what daddy's kinks are. And you don't have to tell your kids exactly where mommy likes to be kissed, exactly what process and foreplay. That is not relevant. And it's not their business. And it would be mortifying to them as adults to think back and think, well, now I know exactly how my parents' foreplay works. Like that's not news people want to hear. And your children don't need that. They need to know that it is an expression of affection, that it's fun, and that you both want to do it. And that's very, very important. Because sexual mysteries are dangerous. This is also not from a children's book. Right? Sexual mysteries are dangerous. And it isn't just this kind of sexual mystery. It's not just the abstinence-only mystery that, now I'm having sex, I might as well just go for it, fuck it. It's also that we don't know what the other side is doing. And what's really, really damaging there is date rape. So much of date rape occurs because of the mystery of the other sex. You have rampant date rape that is essentially a lack of understanding about what consent is. And I know that the atheist next door sort of touched on that this morning. And it's very true. When you don't know how to establish boundaries, and you don't know what boundaries necessarily are, and you don't know that both parties are supposed to want to and are supposed to agree on it, and you don't know what each party is supposed to do. If you don't know, as a say 17-year-old boy, that the vagina will become lubricated, and you'll be able to tell if your partner is enjoying themselves, then how the hell are you supposed to know that they're not enjoying themselves and that you've crossed a boundary, particularly when they don't know what you're supposed to know? You have to have transparency on both sides. You have to say, this is your expectation for yourself, and it has to be that you want to contribute to this exercise, and you have to have expectations for your partner, and that means that you have to communicate with them, as we talked about it, as well with polyamory. Communication is just so important. And you need to let your kids know, and you should be told as young adults, that consent is part of sex, that it's not just, later, once you're having sex, we'll talk about how to figure out if it was rape or not. But that's what we do, and that's madness. It's madness. Just crazy. So consent, very important. You have to talk about whether or not this is a wanted interaction and wanted action. You can, kids, there's that line in sex where the penis goes in the vagina and that's sex. This is what we're taught. And anything aside from that isn't sex. And we know is not true. We know as adults is not true. We know as sexually active adults is not true. And I know everybody in this room knows is not true because you're here. But sex encompasses so much more than just vaginal intercourse. And boundaries are there, and I know lots of couples, through high school who became sexually active with each other, and who had that sort of experience of well, we're not technically having sex because we agreed that we were just going to do oral, and that's okay. And then there are those friends I have as well who decided they were waiting until marriage, and so they only had anal sex because that doesn't count. And like I said, this is one of the ways in which sexual mysteries are dangerous. Anal sex is a perfectly natural thing to do and is a perfectly healthy thing to do, but carries its own separate set of risks. And if all you're talking about is vaginal intercourse, you don't necessarily know what the risks are with anal intercourse. And they're there. There's more of a risk of tearing. There's different risks of infections. There's higher risks of transmitting certain STDs. There's ways to get other STDs that don't apply to vaginal intercourse. And these are things that are totally absent from abstinence-only education. And even from more sex-positive attitudes where it's like, okay, well, you're going to have sex, but all the sex you're going to have is going to be totally heteronormative, right? And so it's, and as if we don't, you mind going back for a second, you'll notice that even this, which is as straightforward as sex education, I think, got in the 1970s, we're still talking about a man, a woman, and the missionary position, right? And so mysteries are dangerous, you know, talk about it, and even if it's really uncomfortable, the opportunities will be there. And people shield their children from these. They're like, well, I'm not going to let my kid watch this movie because it has sex in it. Let them watch the movie and then say, hey, did you see what they were doing? Because, like, you know, people do that, right? And that's it. That can be the end of the conversation. It's like there were people having sex doggy style in that movie. Yeah, that happens. It's cool. It's not, like, dirty or weird. You know, and you can do that. You don't have to shield or be shielded from sex and media necessarily. Sex and media is a way to begin a conversation. And particularly the sex and media that parents are constantly trying to shield their children from are the ones that are not healthy. And that's an even better opportunity. You see something together on TV or in a movie, and you can stop and you can say, you know what, that's not cool. You know, if you hear, if I know most of you are in college, but those of you with kids, if you have kids, you know, who are entering that age where sex is becoming kind of a terrifying reality, and I say a terrifying reality because no matter how enjoyable it is for them as an individual, as a parent, it's always terrifying to envision your child going into something new and potentially dangerous. And so that's always going to be frightening. And so we have this impulse to just shield children from it. And I think in particular a great, and we talked sort of briefly about this outside, a great starter is 50 Shades of Grey. I'm serious, because kids, it's out there. The kids are talking about it, they know it exists, and they have questions about it. And you can start a conversation there by saying, you know what, all of these things that they're doing, these are really things people do, but this is not a safe way to do it. This is not a healthy relationship that these people are experiencing. You know, the sex acts are normal, and people have kinks, and that's fine, and people have their own sexual identities, and that's fine, and that's normal, and that's healthy. But if a guy treats you like that, that is not okay. And how awesome is it that there are these opportunities in the media to actually have those conversations? You know, it's awkward as hell, but then it lasts for 3 minutes and it's done. You don't do it in one big sit-down conversation. You do it bit by bit as the opportunity presents itself. And sex is everywhere. The opportunity will present itself. For example, I take my children to the annual Slut Walk in Chicago. Who's familiar with the Slut Walk? Awesome. So, yeah, we have age-appropriate conversations about bodies and what is appropriate and what is not. And the morning of this particular Slut Walk, I was talking to the kids and reminding them, you know, we're going to this march, and this is what we're going to talk about. And I said, people are going to carry signs, and do you want to have a sign? And the one over in the pink, she, you know, we talked about how, I believe the language I used specifically is sometimes people hurt other people and then say it was their fault because of what they were wearing. And I don't think that's okay. Do you think that's okay? And they say, no, that's ridiculous. If I want to leave the house, you know, wearing a Batman cape and pink tights, like, who the hell cares, right? It's like, yeah. And so she said, you wear what you want to wear. I said, it's a great message. And I asked the one in yellow, I said, what do you want to have on your sign? She said, this is a mantra we have in our house. I'm in charge of my body, which keeps them from poking each other in the backseat of the car. Like, you can't poke me. I'm in charge of my body. And that's a very useful attitude to have later, you know? Like, stop kicking your sister. Who's in charge of her body? She's in charge of her body. So it's... So that's a very helpful thing to do as well. And it's the sort of thing, you can find all kinds of children's books with those messages. And they're 100% anti-bullying books. They're books about dealing with a school bully. And the fact of the matter is that a sexual bully and a school bully are kind of the same thing. And then the last one, she really didn't understand the question, but she also refuses to let me do anything to her unless she's in the mood, from changing a diaper to washing her hair to putting her in her pajamas. So I figured she would appreciate the message. So I got a lot of flack for this picture when I put this up on the internet. The trolls came out in force. And this is the thing that you have to worry about as a parent, being honest with sex and your kids in our culture and our, you know, puritanical environment, which I think is very backwards in a lot of ways, but people came out of the woodwork to tell me that I was raising porn stars and sluts. And, right, and first of all, who cares? You know, if it's their choice when they grow up, you know, if they say to themselves, look, Mom didn't put anything away for our college fund, so we're going to have to put our way through college, and I know for a fact I can make a hell of a lot more money twerking than, you know, whatever, then why the fuck not? Go for it. You know, it's your body so long as you are the person making that decision and making that choice, and you're doing it in an informed way and in a safe way, then I am not in a position to tell them whether or not they can do that. And that, I think, is the most important message you can give your kids, especially when they're young. Because when they're little, when they're this small, if I can tell them that I don't get to say what they do with their body, that means they know when they get older, nobody else can say it either. And that's, I think, very important and helpful to people. You know, so many women especially, they reach adolescence and they're used to people telling them what to do with their body. And then it doesn't take a very manipulative person to come along and say, I get to do it, because already you're used to that environment. And that's very hard. But set the precedent early and you do a lot of favors later. As I was saying about bullying, bodily autonomy, this is sort of what I was getting at. When you give them that sense of bodily autonomy, that they're the only person who gets to decide what happens to their body. And this is one of those bullying books I was talking about, and I hate this book. I just want to go on the record, I cannot stand the Berenstein Bears. Thank you. But I struggle as a feminist with this book because it has a female bully bullying a girl who is then taught to box to defend herself. And so I kind of can't get rid of it, but I still hate it. I don't know. There is a lot of gray area. At any rate, yeah, this is basically what I had just said about knowing your own boundaries and being in charge of them. And what that comes down to is that sex negativity and rape culture are basically the same thing. Has anybody seen this graphic before? Yeah, this is one of the most depressing surveys in possibly all of human history. This is high school students polled and asked when it's basically okay to commit rape. And this is the conditions under which they said, well, that's fine. And the thing that I find most depressing is, I think it's fourth from the bottom, she's going to and then changes her mind. It's not just that more than half of all boys going through high school, you know, who were surveyed, think that, well, she was going to, so I get to go ahead and do it anyway. 31% of girls thought the same thing. They thought they didn't have the bodily autonomy to change their mind. And so when you talk about sex-positive parenting, you're not just talking about necessarily body image or a second, I don't know what happened to my body image slide. Doesn't matter. You're not just talking about sex. You're talking about an entire culture of sex negativity and rape culture. And the thing is, when you empower girls and boys with information about their bodies and information about sex, you give them the tools to negate this. You give them the tools to go into the world as sexual adults and make decisions that make sense and are safe. When you tell somebody, how many people had abstinence-only education? Okay, and that's, how many of you used safe sex practices your first time having sex? Well, of the previous people who raised their hands. Right, when you don't have the information, it's a lot harder to make safe choices. So it's important. It's not just avoiding the body shaming, and it's not just avoiding the sex shaming. It's avoiding all of this later. It's a big picture, and so that's the gist of it. So how am I doing time-wise?
You're doing great. You got like 20 minutes for questions if you want.
Go for it. Well, the question was, she has a 12-year-old daughter, and there's a dress code at the school that's basically slut-shaming. Yeah. and what you can do. And I think that there are two answers. And the one that I know parents generally want to hear is what they can do to advocate on behalf of their child. They can talk to the school board, they can talk to the school, they can talk to the principals, they can talk to teachers, and especially talk to their child and say, you know what, this isn't cool, this is the world, but it's also not cool, and you can do that. But the real answer is you can help your kid sort of subvert the system. There's a blogger, Pickles Inc., Karen Pickles, has a wonderful, wonderful article about doing just that. What is it called? I think it's called something like Yes, Virginia, Feminists Wear Push-Up Bras, something like that, or miniskirts. And it's a story about how when she was in a Catholic middle school, there was a strict dress code for girls. That whole finger thing where you can't show too much leg, and you can't show too much cleavage, and you can't show too much of your neck or your ankles or what the fuck ever. And so what she started doing, and this was as like a 12-year-old, was she started wearing fluorescently colored bras. You could see right through the white shirt that she had to wear. And so she was following that dress code to the letter, but she was still making a point. And it wasn't that she was trying to be sexy. It wasn't that she was trying to attract sexual attention, which is, of course, what people say anytime a woman dresses in a way that is sexually noticeable. She was intentionally making a statement, and the statement is, this dress code is stupid, right? And when you have enough people doing that, even children have the capacity in groups to affect change. And we forget that. We forget that they're people who can act and can learn through action. Right? And so if you teach your 12-year-old, fuck it, they say I can't wear a short skirt. Well, I won't wear a short skirt, but I will wear fishnets, right? Then they're going to have, tell her to talk to her friends. Say, look, this is not cool. This is a sexist policy. This is a slut-shaming policy. Let's subvert it. And once you have enough kids doing that, the school has to address it. And once the school addresses a problem, you can call it out for what it is. So that's my big piece of advice there. Any more questions?
So you did use the term heteronormativity, but I was wondering how you address LGBT issues with your children.
I really wish I had put that in there. Thank you so much. She asked how I address LGBTQ issues with my kids. And, well, first of all, we're really lucky in that we live in a neighborhood, in a city that is very LGBT friendly, and we live in an environment where they're exposed to people who have different sexual orientations. We have poly friends, we have gay friends, we have a lot of diversity in our friend group, and so they're exposed to that, and that's very, very lucky, but it still means we have to talk about it. And parents are terrified of talking about those issues with their kids. They really don't want to do it. So what we do is I try really hard to always make sure my language is inclusive. We only have girls, we don't have boys. And so a lot of the time when I'm talking about sex or talking about puberty or vulvas or whatever, I have to then stop and remind myself, oh, and the boys in your school, this applies to them too. The boys don't have vulvas, they have penises. And then moving forward, if we're talking about like getting married, we went to a wedding, so they're very interested in weddings. And I said, well, some of Daddy's friends are getting married, and that's going to be really exciting. And their names are, she and she. I don't want to out anybody accidentally. So, and when their reaction is, like, well, boys marry girls. It's like, no. You can love whoever you want. Who's your best friend? Like, well, my best friend is a girl. Right. Well, what if you grow up and you want to marry your best friend? Like, that's fine. Mommy and Daddy are best friends and we're married, and that's cool. And you don't have to get married. And we try to, round it out. I have become guilty of my father's sins. Instead of just giving an answer, I give a lecture, and but I still try to keep it brief because kids can only pay attention to so long and ingest so much. But whenever those conversations come up, you've got to constantly think about it, and that's hard. I mean, there's just no getting around it. It's hard. It's hard to always be gender inclusive. It's hard to always be LGBTQ friendly in all of your language. It's especially hard to always be trans inclusive. And one of their babysitters is trans, is genderqueer. And so that's something we talk about to a certain extent. We don't talk about genitalia, we don't talk about sexual preferences. It's none of their business and it's none of my business. But we do talk about pronouns, and we do talk about this is a nice person, and this is just a person, and this is how they are in their life. And so, like I said, we're very lucky in that we have these people in our lives to keep reminding us of that. But we also have to, every parent has to force themselves, to remember to include people who aren't necessarily present. Any other questions? Or I hope I answered that question. So what she asked is, she was raised in a sex-negative environment, and she has younger siblings, and she wants to know how to talk to her parents about talking to them, or how to talk to them, or both. Okay, so talking to your parents about sex sucks. It always, always, always sucks. It sucks 100% of the time. Okay, I take it back. Talking to your parents about your sex sucks. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable. They don't want to know, you don't want to know. Asking them questions about sex, and is a different story. Talking to them about the fact that you're having it and the way in which you're having it and the way in which it does not correspond to the way they are having it, that sucks. So I apologize for the previous blanket statement, narrowing it down. So the way to talk to your parents that I would recommend when it comes to talking to them about the impact of a sex-negative environment is casually. Don't jump into it. Never jump into it and say, look, what you taught me was kind of harmful, and it's taken a lot of work for me to get through that. Instead, say, hey, did you hear that they went to abstinence-only education in Texas and the teen pregnancy rate tripled? There's an in. And then once that's it, is there's sex in our environment everywhere. And once it's been exposed, once there's somewhere to see it, you can start the conversation. As far as talking with your younger siblings, I say just go for it. You're an authority to them. You're an older sibling. That's the way the sibling relationships kind of work. And in addition to that, as siblings, you're kind of already constantly doing things behind your parents' back anyway. Let's be reasonable. So if you feel like you can talk to them, then do. What's the worst that could happen is that they'll tell your parents that you told them something, and then you get to have that conversation with your parents. It's all about being honest and reasonable and not freaking out because it's just sex, right? We don't panic. We don't panic. Does that answer your question? I'll get to you in a second. There was a.
Have you ever tried to instill some of these values into someone else's children, maybe a friend or family member, and their ignorance reacting to the way you do this, and how might you go about that?
Now, this is a really, really tricky, really difficult question. What he asked was talking to other people's kids about sex. And this is a really important question because I sort of glossed over it when I was talking before because I start talking really fast and forget where I was going. But we are terrified of sex, and we are terrified of children and sex. We are terrified of children having sex. We are terrified that children will be sexualized, and in the process of doing that, we sexualize them. And so just look at toddlers and tiaras. We assume, we equate body parts with sex acts. We equate a vulva with sex. We equate breasts with sex. We equate a penis with sex. And as a result, any adult talking to a child about sex becomes, by society at large, immediately suspicious of sexual acts with children. Because those are sex parts. That's all they do. If you talk to a little boy about his penis, then maybe you're fondling his penis when his parents aren't looking. And that's the fear that we as a society have because we're so terrified of sex. And children we're terrified, like I said before, we're terrified of things happening to them. And that's one of the things I wish I had remembered to spend more time on when we're talking to children about anatomical honesty. Here, I'm gonna go back right quick. Those parts. Here it says a pee-pee for making wee-wee, right? Right. The truth is that a vulva does a lot more than that, and it's not called a pee-pee. But it does a lot more than this. And it's important, when we tell kids, like, these are your hands, they're for clapping, right? We don't do that. We say you can pick up a fork, you can poke somebody, you can clap, you can scratch your head, like your hands do many things. Your vulva does many things. You know, it's an amazing, your vagina is an amazing self-regulating machine, you know, and you can tell them about that. But the problem is that other parents, by and large, don't have those conversations. As you were saying, those parts are for sex, and other than that, you don't talk about it. And so what ends up happening? There are two real reactions that I've found so far to other parents learning about the way I talk to my kids about sex in the real world, not on the internet, which is a very different universe entirely, but like other parents at playgroup or school or whatever. The two reactions are abject horror and casually sending their kids over when I might have one of those conversations. Because they don't want to do it, because it's too frightening. But the thing is, you don't know what kind of parent this parent is going to be until it's happened. So you have to be really careful about talking to other people's kids about sex, because the assumption automatically is that you're a predator, especially as a man, which is really unfortunate and unfair. But it's the assumption. If a man is going to use anatomical terms with children, then he must be a predator. You know, and that's true. You know, it's the perception. That's true that is the perception. It's not true that is the reality. But you know, that's the way we look at it, and we have to recognize that this is the way our society views children, anatomy, and adults. So, am I out of time? No. Okay. Sorry. I'm sorry. So yeah. So you have to be careful, and you have to desexualize the body. You have to start from the beginning, and when you talk to other people's kids, if it comes up, you have to be very careful to desexualize. You know, if you're going to talk to another kid about sex or about organs, you know, about anatomy, you have to be clear that it's age appropriate and that you're including boundaries. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say. So if another kid is over and is like, oh well, vaginas and vulvas and penises, and you're like, and that's private for you and not for me, but you can talk to your parents about it. And that's a good sort of safety buffer, because then when they do tell their parents about it, that's part of what you told them, is that that's private, it's not my place, it's not my responsibility. And even then, there's still a risk that parents are going to see it as predatory, because that's the environment that we live in. That's how sex negative our environment is. Down here first, you still? Where do you find the opportunity?
Yeah, where do I find the opportunity?
So the question is where to find an opportunity to talk about sex with a 10-year-old girl who basically knows how it works. And because here's the thing about sex when you don't talk to your kids about it. It's kind of like Christianity, in that if you're here in this country, in this culture, and you grow up here, you're going to learn about it. You're going to have it sort of inside of you forever. That information is going to grow along with you. You're going to know it. Whether or not you're intending to, whether or not that's what you're trying to do, it's there. You know, you can't grow up without real work on your parents' part, without knowing, first of all, who Jesus is and what Christianity is and the basic tenets of Christianity, or what sex is, how it works, and what bodies are supposed to look like. And this is what I was saying before about finding opportunities. I think some really great opportunities are Monty Python movies. I'm dead serious. If you watch, say, Life of Brian, that's a perfect choice. Life of Brian with a 10-year-old. The 10-year-old is going to be able to get that humor. And the 10-year-old is going to be able to get that subversion, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend to a bunch of Christian parents to watch Life of Brian with their kids. But it has full frontal for both genders. It has full frontal nudity for Brian, and then for the, what's her name, Judith, I think is her name. At any rate, full frontal nudity in both cases. They have sex, there's a discussion of it, and then you don't even have to wait, like, okay, we're at that moment, and pause the movie, we're going to have the conversation. You wait till afterwards. You're like, hey, you know, what did you think of the full frontal? You know? And that's the sort of conversation people have anyway. You know, having it with your parents is a bit awkward, but that's the opportunity. It doesn't have to be, you know, a long conversation. Be like, hey, you might have noticed, like, she didn't shave. And I know, like, all the porn stars are shaved. Like, vulvas don't have to look like that. And you might have noticed, like, her breasts, they weren't, like, perfectly round and, like, way up here, because she's a person, and, like, people look like that. Life of Brian is great because it doesn't have this sanitized nudity. It just has nudity. And it's funny, and it's a great movie, and it's totally worth watching. It just also happens to have those in it, right? So I highly recommend that. Monty Python has lots of casual nudity, and so that's a great place to start watching those with your kids. And once again, it's one of those things where parents are always trying to shield their kids from things. Like, we can't watch Monty Python. It's filled with swearing, and there's penises. I mean, come on. But it's great. It gives you that opportunity to, talk about it. And even if you don't want to talk about it, at least you know that she's seen a real penis sort of in the real world, and that's what it really looks like. And that's not nearly as frightening as, like, the girl who's going to have the Cosmo and talk about, like, how to fit 16 inches of cock down her throat, right? Cosmo is awful. I hope that answered your question. There was one in the back again, I think. Okay. All right, I'm really glad you asked me that question. The question is how to have these sort of conversations when it comes to the access kids have thanks to the internet. And I want to give you I've been on the internet for a ridiculously long time. My father is what he did, was mime development, internet standards. So I sort of grew up with the internet in my house, the days pre-AOL. And let me tell you, the internet is the great equalizer. It makes everything just as accessible and inaccessible to anybody, right? Which is delightful in the terms of Wikipedia and is terrifying in terms of keeping your children shielded from boobs and penises. Which we don't want to do, as we've discussed, as I've discussed, that keeping them shielded from that doesn't do them any favors. What you can do, however, is you can use it. Check. I don't normally recommend invading anybody's privacy, including kids. But if you suspect that they're looking at, really outlandish pornography, or even like any pornography, you can mention it. You can say, hey, I saw on the browser history, that you were looking at, gangbangs. And you don't have to freak out about it. It's just sex, right? You don't have to freak out about it. But you can say, look, I just want you to know that this isn't how sex works necessarily in the real world. People don't, I was talking before about this outside of this room. But there is this one view we've chosen, sometimes back in the 60s or 70s, that this is what the vulva looks like, and these are what the breasts look like. And they're in a certain size range. They have a specific nipple to areola to breast ratio, and vulva has a specific look to it. The clitoris has a specific size. All of the porn you see, they're going to get as close to that as possible. And so it's a really excellent opportunity to talk about, and especially with boys and women's sex organs, because you're going to, if you have girls, you're going to have to talk to them about their vulvas. And like I said, there's a way to do it, and talking about this is normal, and this is your body, and this is what it looks like, and that's healthy, and that's what it does. And boys don't, boys and girls don't hear about the other sex organs, and that's sort of what I was trying to say, needing to find that balance. But porn is actually a really good way to do that. Like this is a vulva in porn. In real life, a clitoris can be as big as your thumb. Like that's a normal thing that happens. And we don't really talk about that. In real life, vulvas can have longer lips or shorter lips. They can have more hair or less hair. The hair can go higher or it can go broader. There's different shapes. There's different amounts of fat tissue on the mons. There's all of these different ways it can look. And we don't even think about that. We're like, there's one picture in pornography and in, movies that have breasts in them, that this is what they look like, and so girls, they hit this stage where their bodies are developing, and suddenly they have these enormous nipples or inverted nipples, then compared to what they've ever seen, and it must mean that they're wrong, that their bodies are wrong, and their bodies are gross. And teaching them from the beginning, there's a variety. This is your body, and your body, does these things, and other bodies do other things. And somebody once decided, that this decade, the look for breasts is B cup, perfectly round, higher up on the, by the shoulders, and with really long nipples. Like that's the thing now, but they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And I think that pornography is actually a really good opportunity to discuss that, and not to go looking for it. I don't recommend sitting a kid down and Googling varieties of nipples, but letting them know, this is a fantasy, and people are acting out a fantasy, and it's okay to act out fantasies, but it has to be consensual. And hopefully, if you're watching videos that include the fantasy of a lack of consent, the actors have consented, and this is a role that they're playing. And I think that is really important, because there's a lot of porn out there that is not consensual. one of the first pornographic films I ever saw was definitely not consensual, or consent under duress, which is still not really consent. And that was kind of traumatic for me. I can't imagine how traumatic it was for the actress. But it's an important thing to say, like if it's non-consensual, you should be able to tell. You should be able to see if what you're watching is a crime or is a consensual act. And if it's a crime, don't watch it, because that's exploitation. And I think that's an important line too. If consent is part of the sex talk, then they'll know when what they're watching is bad. And the fact of the matter is there's bad sex. There's non-consensual sex, which is rape, which is bad. It still falls into this category of sex because we have to educate about it in the same terms, right? It's non-consensual. It involves sex organs interacting. It's not about pleasure, it's about power, and it has to be part of that conversation. And pornography, it straddles a line. It's exploitation, but it's consensual exploitation. And so you have to be able to draw a line and say, this is what they're doing, and if you know that that's not what you're doing, what you're seeing is a crime. Did that answer your question? Are there any other questions? One more, I'm sorry. You.
I don't know if your daughters are at that age yet, but when do you think they might be ready to start dating, or when do you think they're interested in it? What kind of conversations do you think you'll have with them?
Oh, that's another slide I managed to lose. Sorry. If you were here at the beginning for the Atheist Next Door, they had a great slide up about, dear daughter, I want you to have great sex. And I think the attitude of the dad polishing his shotgun when the first date comes over is dangerous. I think it's dangerous because it's like I said before with bodily autonomy. I don't get to say what they do with their body, which means I don't get to say who they do it with either, and that's part of the education, and that's part of consent, and it's part of bodily autonomy. So when they start dating, and they're definitely not there yet, when they start dating, they're going to have to answer those questions, and I'm not going to ask them, well, show me on the doll what you did with so-and-so last night. What I am going to do is say, make sure that you're not doing anything you don't want to do. I think that's the most important thing I can say to them as their mother, is that you're not doing anything you don't want to do. And make sure that if something happens and you don't want it to happen, and that afterwards you feel really weird about it, you talk about it. And not just with me, although I would appreciate that, but also with them. Because once again, it's this mystery, this dangerous sexual mystery. When you have those early interactions, your first boyfriends and girlfriends, and then you do something that's like sort of sexual for the first time, and then they never call you again. I think most of us had kind of an experience like that at one point, and we don't know why. It's a mystery. Why the hell did we do that thing and then just broke up, or whatever you do when you're 13? I don't know. You don't know, because there's this mystery. You didn't talk about it. There's no communication. You can't say, look, I really wasn't comfortable with that, and it was a violation of my consent and my body. Because we don't have that language. Like I said, the language is new. The language is new, but we can empower children with that language now that we have it. And I think that's a good thing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.